unlocking your world of creativity with best-selling author and brand innovator, Mark Stinson. This episode is brought to you by White Cloud Coffee Roasters, where every bean tells a story of adventure. Visit whitecloudcoffee.com and use the code CREATIVITY.
Welcome back, friends, to our podcast, Your World of Creativity. I'm Mark Stinson. And after more than 400 interviews with creative professionals around the world, and while writing my new book, Unlock Your World of Creativity, I noticed something surprising. The creatives who are really sustaining success over time aren't just the most talented. They're also the ones who know their numbers. Now, before you think this episode is just about accounting or spreadsheets or tax reduction, it's a lot more than that. The numbers really tell a story about who we're serving and whether we're making impact or not. If our business is healthy, which ideas deserve more investment? And that's the kind of thing we want to explore today with our guests in our roundtable called Knowing Your Numbers. And joining me are remarkable founders who each measure their success a little bit differently, but they understand that creativity is more powerful when we have meaningful metrics. So welcome in Alisa Sparks, who's grown Linden Creek from a garage startup to a nationally recognized home staging franchise. Alisa, welcome in.
Thanks so much for having me, Mark. I'm excited to
Yes,
be here.
thank you. And Andrea Carter, whose research has revealed the numbers behind concepts like belonging, trust, organizational culture. They sound soft, but there's numeric data behind it, isn't there, Andrea?
There absolutely is. Thanks for having me, Mark, and lovely to be here with our other panelists.
Yes. And Rei Vardi, who started with a single Tesla and then created Eon rides into a nationwide virtual fleet. Rei, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Mark. Happy to be here.
Yeah, to get started, I'd love to go around and ask each of you what you're working on today, these days, and maybe what one metric you feel like you watch every week that matters to your business. Alisa, maybe we can get started with you.
Absolutely. So we are a home staging and interior design franchise, as you mentioned. And so my day to day gets to be really in a business coaching role where I get to help new emerging entrepreneurs that are building their businesses. And so we love to hyper focus on our numbers. That's a big part of what we do. Yes, we create beautiful spaces. We get to design and elevate kind of everybody's everyday living. But if the math doesn't math, one, it doesn't make sense for our customer. And two, we don't get to stay in business. And so one of those key metrics that we really like to pay attention to is less around, hey, here's what our top line revenue is or something like that. But it's actually around activity. How many relationships have we connected with on any given week to be able to generate new sales, new relationships in that respect? And that's one of the key metrics we love to track and monitor.
Andrea, what are you working on and what numbers are you watching?
So as an organizational scientist, I have a lot of numbers that I have to look at, but what I'm launching very shortly is actually my first book on belonging, how we actually are able to measure and the actual data that goes behind the 5 indicators and the conditions that you need in order to produce belonging. And belonging, I think a lot of people understand it as a soft concept, but it actually predicts a person's performance. And that's actually launching this fall, which I'm super excited about it. I would say the things that I measure the most and that I look at the most are actually the conditions underneath how people are performing. And so if you look at survey data, if you look at the things that most organizations measure, they're actually measuring the wrong things. And the data actually covers up the places that human perception can't see. And so that's really what I'll be unpacking today in our roundtable and in our discussion.
Fantastic. Rei, what are you watching?
Sure. My company, Eon, we're an electric car sharing and rental platform. So we connect unused and underutilized vehicles from owners, big and small, whether they're private individuals or large corporate rental car companies. We integrate directly with the cars and we create this system that's just a frictionless booking and rental experience. So you can book a car, show up as you arrive, your phone becomes a digital key, in and out in 40 seconds, and you're on your way. Basically, the smoothest rental operation in existence at the moment. And the number that I am always focused on is obviously revenue is clearly important for every business, and everyone's going to be looking at that all the time. But the thing that really matters to us is basically a secondary mark of the customer experience, which is retention. If you have people that are coming and they're booking again and again and they're returning to the product, that is your best indicator of how good that customer experience actually is. And so people actually vote with their wallet based on their preferences. If they like the experience, they will pay for it again. If they don't, they will leave and never come back. And so that's how we're always focused on how do we refine and continue optimizing this experience so that people keep coming back.
And maybe to pick up on that thought and continue it, Ray, you've still got the creativity. A lot of creative people think the numbers are constraining or they're limiting or they box me in. I just want to be creative, they might say. How do you balance keeping an eye on that metric while still asking your teams to show that innovation, show that creativity?
I think that the numbers, framing it as the numbers being a constraint on your creativity, is kind of like saying that the subject matter that you're painting is a constraint on your creative juices, right? The numbers are the frame. The numbers are the description of the problem, the subject matter that you're addressing, right? If you're looking at the numbers and the numbers say, hey, we need to keep a focus on customer experience, or hey, the numbers are showing we're actually not doing enough outreach to bring in more new customers. That's actually a definition of your problem. Your creativity comes in, how do I solve this problem? Van Gogh's creativity wasn't constrained by the fact that he was doing landscape. That's part of the thing that he was focused on as a subject, but it's actually in his taste, his skill, his vision that he can redo the subject in his own way. And so that's how I like to think about data and numbers in relation to creativity.
Yes.
It's really just a framing of here's what you should work on.
And Alisa, not only building your own business, but now, of course, in franchising, you're trying to replicate these experiences by location. How have the numbers guided rather than constrained your business?
It's interesting. My background before dabbling in the home staging and interior design world was actually in finance. I spent nearly a decade managing budgets for the Department of Defense and then decided to make this massive career shift into staging houses. And I remember when I made that shift, I thought, no one's going to take me seriously in the creative world because I'm a numbers girl. And I hated my background. I was embarrassed to tell anybody what my background really was. I was like, I've got some experience in real estate. This is why I'm qualified. But what was interesting is years into practicing the creative side of our industry and really understanding and honing it, I realized that having the finance background actually gave me this competitive advantage against other business owners that came in as a creative. They loved the creative side, and then they'd forget that somewhere along the lines they needed to pay attention to the numbers. Whereas because it was part of my DNA and what I've always known, I started with the numbers and then said, how do we solve? How do we create? How do we build? And so when we open locations, we coach through numbers first and then creativity being the solution, really similar to what Ray said. We take that same framework of this is the budget that you're given. This is the unique project or house that you have, whether it is a $400,000 house or a $6 million house, that's going to change the amount that somebody as a client should be investing in staging to get their best return on investment. But every creative decision we make is around return on investment and optimizing our clients' money. And so really, we utilize numbers and finances as our base before we make any decisions on colors and layouts and patterns, because that's what's going to ultimately matter most to our clients.
And Andrea, you were describing measuring a lot of things that most people think are soft. Many organizations struggle with trying to quantify what does belonging mean? What does teamwork look like? What does collaboration sound like? What do you think when you talk to leaders? Do they gravitate or desire that kind of measurement? Or do they say, I'd rather measure something easier?
That's such a great question. What I see, so let me go back to my original research of where we started and why creativity in my opinion, is not constrained by numbers, but is very much guided. And when you look at a survey, a workforce or a customer, everyone reports the mean, whether that's engagement, whether that's discretionary effort, whether that's culture, whether that's retention. That's an average score that most people are looking at. And the average score is really the story that the leaders want. The distribution is the story employees and customers are living. That's the difference. And the average will always smooth into one number, and the people who most need to be seen actually disappear inside it. So I see the average as an agreement to look away. And in my research, this is where this started. So I quit letting the average do the thinking for me. And that was really where the creativity began to take flight. Because what I realized was that if I went deeper and I got really curious about what was hiding underneath the average, I could actually find more information that allowed the people who needed to be seen, known, valued, protected, honored, and understood. And the gap between the average and that hidden information was where the research was actually guided forward. And so I see that gap, right? That gap between the mean and then what's underneath the mean. That's where your truth actually lies in a way. And I couldn't find that information just through intuition or empathy. The numbers allowed me to go there. The statistical analysis, the way that you actually look at multiplicative analysis rather than just looking at a distribution or the mean, the average, all of that allows you to go into exactly where people are actually telling you what's going on. That's not a constraint. That's actually, I think of it like a flashlight. And so if I look at my original research, 74% of the 3,508 participants were male because it was in mining and that was the population distribution. And most people would think, oh, if they're 75% male, approximately, then everyone should feel like they belong. But that's where, when we broke the data apart, the gaps actually showed us where people who we expected to feel that they belonged didn't. And they showed up by a function, they showed up by a level of leadership, they showed up by education. And those are quiet forces that push people out or bring people in. And that actually kills whether or not there's innovation or whether there's discretionary effort or whether people can actually perform at their best. I would say if you look at trying to measure just to control people,
Yes.
it's going to flatten everything, right? But I look at measuring as a way to reveal a story or reveal what's really underneath that question. And
So interesting.
and the numbers kind of say, go look here. And the creativity is everything you do once you're standing there.
Alisa, as I'm listening to Andrea, I'm thinking about the two-way street that franchisees might look at your company. It's like you're looking for the right franchisees, the right locations, the right fit, the right teamwork, but they're also looking at you. Is this a good fit? Can we work with them? How do you put these kind of metrics into your decision-making?
Yeah, that's a great question. When it comes to a franchise relationship, I always say it's a lot like a marriage. We are signing up for a 10-year contract and hopefully end up doing this together even longer, where we are committed to working together. And so that is not a one-way street. That doesn't mean they just say, hey, I want a franchise, and I say yes. It also doesn't mean that I say, I want you, and they say, great, I want you too. That has to go both ways. And so the discovery process, there is a numbers piece of it. We're really candid about financials and what we've seen historically so that they get that clear picture as they're choosing to make a really big investment with their retirement funds or taking out a loan with SBA or whatever it may be. But another piece of that decision making is really around trust and goals and character. What we find is in this season, most of our franchise owners are really in a place where they want to make a career shift. They've done something exceptional in their career thus far, but they want to do something different. They maybe want to build something of their own. They want to pivot to something creative, right? But again, with the creativity, you need those numbers to back and base that. And so in this discovery process, both ways, we are wildly candid about the good, the bad, the ugly, and almost more so about the ugly than the good sometimes, because I'd rather you see everything and make an educated decision and say, that's the fit that I'm looking for. That's the hard work that I want to invest into, rather than the alternative of thinking everything is beautiful with rose-colored glasses and then opening the door and going, wait a second, it's a lot of work to start a business and I had no idea. And so I think it's a candid conversation of so many decisions that aren't just numbers in this. It's what does your new lifestyle look like when you become an entrepreneur and a business owner? What does this look as you build and develop a team? is this an industry and a career that you're excited about leading into? And is this a community within our brands that you want to be a part of and engaged in? And all of those things are part of our decision making.
Very good. Ray, I'd like to ask you about those rose-colored glasses. I've watched a couple of interviews that you've had about building without venture capital, but the economics of it weren't always what you wanted to hear. It takes a little bit of courage to hear numbers that don't always fit maybe with your optimistic hope, wish, and dream.
Sure. Any entrepreneur will tell you that hearing bad numbers is literally like your day in, day out.
Yes.
That's what you're signed up for. You're showing up knowing that you have this picture. It's like, here's where we are right now. Here's where we want to be. And the creative part is figuring out how to get from point A to point B. I think in this kind of broader discussion of how do you balance out putting a big focus on your creativity, but also utilizing numbers and data and left brain thinking to make sure that you get to where you want to be. I think anybody who is out there building something has this intuitive sense that they're both components of your problem solving skill set. If you only focus on one of those, you're just a numbers person, you apply no creativity, or vice versa. You're only a creative, but you don't get any guidance from the number. It's like going to the gym and working out just your right side of your body. It's counterproductive, because however you look at it, it's like a yin and yang type of relationship. In any endeavor that you are trying to get to, both components are going to be fully expressed. You're thinking about, I want to retire. Okay, why do you want to retire? Oh, so I can do creative pursuits. Okay, you want to retire to do creative pursuits, you're going to have to set up a retirement plan. That's numbers. And then you want to dive deeper in there. How do I get the numbers so that I can retire? You have to be creative about it. That's the whole dog chasing its tail kind of situation. It just goes in a circle. So I would say that anytime that you are coming up on a confrontation when it comes to numbers, when it comes to a block, use the other tool in your arsenal to kind of get around it. You have a writer's block, you have a creativity block on how to solve this problem. Dive deeper into the numbers. It'll help sharpen your pencil. You've got the numbers, but you don't know how to get from point A to point B. Dive into creativity, throw different things at the wall. And that's really how I think, coming from a business side, from an entrepreneurial side, you get around those problems. For us, when I couldn't raise capital, because I did try early on in the business, I started to think, okay, what are other creative ways that we can just get to the next stage? And that was the breakthrough we needed. And I think that's how it works for everybody who's deeply passionate about building a business.
Yes. It's going to be right along this time in the podcast. The listener's going to say, look, all this number stuff is good, but I trust my gut. I have a good intuition. I know when I feel it. But what would each of you respond in that way? It's, yes, intuition is important. Instinct is good. But you really do have to listen to the numbers. Andrea, what would you say to somebody who says that?
Yeah, I would say measurement is what made my work travel to begin with, right? So a framework validated with mining data went from 3,500 people into manufacturing, into healthcare, into finance, into the public sector, into nonprofit. That's how one study became work, reaching over 150,000 employees and impacting their lives and their performance and how much they feel valued within an organization. And I think unmeasured creativity is something that keeps us small. It's more of a personal story. It lives and dies with you in a way, whereas measured creativity is what becomes repeatable by others. And that's a whole difference between just looking at a personal gift versus looking at infrastructure. Had I not had the data, I wouldn't have been able to build the infrastructure that was repeatable within organizations across industries. And I think that methodology, we've seen an average of 24% reduction in belonging gaps, 18% increase in engagements, discretionary effort going from 23% to 84%. Those are huge numbers, and those numbers exist because we measured them from day one. And you can't prove things that were never counted. And I think those are the pieces that we want to talk about, our intuition. We want to talk about our gut feeling. And that's the neuroscience behind a lot of it, which isn't wrong. And we can still understand it. But I think the piece that's really important is that your numbers are often what you're avoiding. And if you go there, if you look there, you can actually regulate a lot of those hard truths to help you grow faster so that it's not just a platitude, right? Like you're actually growing. And that's neuroscience mixed with data.
Alisa, I'm curious how you balance or combine instinct and experience with the evidence and the numbers.
I would say from my past experience, I've learned my gut's not always right. And I've had to learn that the hard way a few times. And so it forces me to rely on the numbers. There are times you make a hire and you're like, oh, my gut says this is a good one. And then you backtrack and 90 days in, you look mathematically at the sales they've produced or what they've generated. And you go, wait a second, this wasn't the right hire. And so I think sometimes when you go, it's easier to just make this gut decision than to dive in and do my due diligence on the numbers. It's those moments that sometimes you happen to be right, but it's like gambling because sometimes you're not going to be right. You might build a creative that you think is going to perform exceptionally. And then all of a sudden you find out that it absolutely tanked and you were completely off. But you have to be willing to, if you're going to make a decision, test it with your guts and watch the numbers and see what actually happens, or it can put you in a really tough position. And so I would say don't take the shortcut. Don't just make the quick decision. If you want to use that as a hypothesis, as something to test, feel free to do, but you need data and numbers to be able to back those decisions because that's what's going to really teach you and tell your business where you need to go and what's going to be successful.
And Rei, you were talking about the mission of the company, which often is emotionally loaded because you want people to be energetic and excited about a mission. But then you also have the daily goals, the metrics, the numbers. How do you see those fitting together?
Yeah, I think the way Alisa framed it was kind of nailed it, in my opinion, right? I see, first of all, the mission and the daily metrics are interwoven day by day, right? So it's not like there's a tension there necessarily. I think where it comes to making decisions based on gut or based on numbers, the way I view it is that your gut is data. There is something going on there. Typically, when you have a gut reaction to something, it's because you're subconsciously perceiving something that seems off or does not match the pattern that you've come to expect. That can be incredibly powerful where you have domain authority and domain experience. So if you're operating in an environment where you don't really have that much data, and for entrepreneurs that are starting out or early in their careers, this is pretty much where you exist, right? There's not much of you to go off of. Alisa, for example, with her story of she goes from managing budgets at the Defense Department to home staging. What is she going off if not gut feelings, right? This is the irrational start of something new that you think that you can pull off, right? But as you start to grow and start to scale and more data starts to come in, this is where your gut might start pulling you in the wrong direction. And that's because now there's new sets of data that are not intuitively built into you, but that are external and that you haven't absorbed and processed. The sweet spot is when you get to a place of experience where new data comes in a domain you're not that expert in. You spend the time to get more acquainted, understand where that data fits in. You develop a skill set in that domain. And now your gut is much more finely tuned than it was before. And just to give you an example, so it's not super abstract, I came from a place where I studied biomedical engineering in my early career, right? As the company was scaling, we were having a lot of conversations with people who were saying, I can come in and do marketing for you. My gut had zero good experience to say, this person knows what they're talking about. This person is selling me a story that'll never work. As I started to grow with the company, I started to learn a lot of these marketing skills. I started to understand things like cost of customer acquisition, LTV, return on ad spend. And as you start to learn these skills yourself, and this is a time-bound process, this takes time, your gut starts to get much more finely tuned. And so now when I'm talking to someone who is in marketing and they're selling me a story, now the gut check is much more trustworthy than it was in the past.
You got the abs built, the gut.
It's perfectly said.
Yeah. Andrea, I wanted to pick up on one thought that it's the data moved it from abstract to something we could measure. But I wanted to look at the outcome of the numbers for a second. And there are people who are too dependent or focused on the dashboards and watching the numbers, and every now and then have to look up and see the human, see the person behind these numbers. I wondered if you could speak to that. How do we translate or how do we implement and execute a strategy built on numbers, but building the person?
Yeah, it's such a great question. Thanks for tossing that ball over to me. I appreciate it, Mark. I think what you've heard, and this is where it gets tricky because what Rei and Alisa spoke to is really that gap that exists between intuition and data, which is where a lot of our human bias comes from. And that's where it gets really tricky because you can make mistakes really easily. And so here's a really great way to kind of pressure test this. And it's one of my favorite human numbers, if you will, because anyone can collect data. In your next meeting, though, pay attention to what's happening between your intention and your impact. This is the gap in human experience. Like we've talked about, anyone can collect data, but in your next meeting, in your next dinner party, at the next barbecue that you're at with family, count who speaks and count who gets credit for ideas. Count who gets interrupted. Count who people remember. Because what's really fascinating about belonging is that people assume that belonging is a feeling and that it can't be measured. That was one of the things that I faced early on in my research. And my research actually shows the exact opposite. Belonging is actually not how you feel. Belonging is how you perform. And performance leaves a huge trail of numbers everywhere if you're actually willing to count rather than just look at that gut. And so counting is actually, people will say counting's transactional. Here's the thing, counting makes you notice, which makes you kinder. And when you count somebody who hasn't spoken or the next move in an invitation, those are elements that provide a perspective that haven't been experienced yet. And the number creates that care. So nobody experiences life just through a transaction. They experience it through what they're observing and the past experiences that they've had. But those past experiences can actually lead to a wrong decision. And you have to be able to look at what's between them. And that's really where the performance of people come together. Because when that doesn't exist, it's exhausting and you're constantly on protection mode. So we actually need to be able to connect with people in a way that allows people to feel seen and heard and understood. And that doesn't happen just through intuition because our bias steps in time and time again. And that was one of the reasons why, with my original research, the average was such a problem, because the mining industry leaders were like, we have a 72, we're good, we're golden, we don't have to do any more work. And the minute you started going underneath that, you started really understanding, okay, whose designations were actually taking over the actual picture and clouding what needed to happen. And that is information that happens anywhere, not just in the boardroom and not just in a business. It happens in your families. It happens in your friendships. It happens every single day.
Giving me something to do at the next family barbecue. I'll be doing market research around the picnic table. Yeah. Alisa, maybe we could pick up on the idea that Andrea is talking about from a internal organizational, but translate it now externally to the customer experience. That how do you use the numbers to replicate the brand experience that you're trying to create, franchise by franchise, location by location, and interaction by interaction? You really want it to be something that is standard operating process. How do we use the numbers to engage the person at that level?
Yeah, absolutely. So much of our clients' decision making isn't around, hey, I want you to make my house look pretty. They're turning around and selling your house, right? They care about, how are you going to give me the best investment as I turn around and sell this property? And so much of our model is built around really optimizing ROI, thinking through those details. And we think about numbers and metrics consistently in every one of these locations as we think about which inventory pieces to invest in. Every one of those decisions is really more a mathematical solution than it is this is a pretty sofa. Is that a sofa that is going to last on truck rides 10, 15, 20, 30 times when it bumps up and down, or is it going to get scuffed? Is it so white that the second that it gets a scuff, we can't now fix it? Or is it a durable material? Every one of those little micro decisions is oftentimes more made based on numbers than it is actually on the visibility of a pretty white sofa. And so a lot of our ability to replicate what we're doing and to build a business model that can be successful is really around the decision making we've learned along the way of those numbers that really do matter. And you had brought up the question of how do you bring in the people and the impact piece of it. I think what's so fun about numbers to me is they become your how. How are we going to achieve this result? But the people piece of it is your why. I remember the very first staging I ever did, the house sold very quickly. It sold $30,000 over asking. And my metrics brain was like, nailed it. This is going to be a great case study. 30,000 over asking. We're here for it. Right. But then the client looked at me and he said, Alisa, that extra $30,000 we weren't planning on. You have no idea what that is going to do for our family and for our life. And it's that moment right there that you pause and you reflect and you go, that's why. That's why we do this. That's why we are in business. That's why we get to make an impact. We get to do it through the numbers. But holding on to that why and that people piece of it is the fuel that keeps you going through those challenges every single day.
What a fantastic conversation. I'd like to close by going around and asking maybe a summary type question. And Rei will pick up on this idea of exercising our numbers muscle. If a listener, talk to an individual person who's listening to say, here's a specific action or habit you could start building this week to strengthen, become more confident, more informed, more comfortable with the numbers. What could we do and an action that we could take as a creative person to strengthen our numbers muscle? Rei, could I start with you?
Look, it's a bit of a difficult recommendation to make because everybody's focused on improving a different aspect in their life. Maybe you're watching your weight or you're trying to get in shape. Maybe you are focused on growing your business, your customer base. Maybe it's you're trying to learn a language and you're trying to get better and better at that. Regardless of what it is, there's this adage, it goes, what gets measured gets managed. It's almost impossible to manage something without being able to know where it was and where it is now and where it's going to go. Once you start getting a handle on, here's how I could write this down and see where my progress is, that's where you can start testing, A/B testing different strategies. When it comes to your weight loss, for example, maybe it's the amount of time that you've spent at the gym, and maybe it's the amount of calories you eat. You actually don't know what's easier or harder for you to focus on if you're not measuring what it is that you're doing. So regardless of what it is that you're focused on, I think that just setting up a habit of just tracking what it is that you're doing is already going to get you so much further ahead than anybody else who's just sitting there wishful thinking. And to make it even easier for you, the cool thing is that there's almost no endeavor that you can embark on that doesn't have measurement tools built in, right? There's 1,001 different business tools that measure everything from conversion rate to customer clicks to revenue to you name it. And then on personal projects, hell, you could even, if you're learning a language, take a test every week and see what your actual progress is. That's going to motivate you. That's going to show you where your weak points are. And so understand that I think just telling yourself that you haven't really embarked on a project or any sort of process until you actually write it down on paper, that more than anything is probably going to be your best step. You haven't started learning a language unless you're measuring it. You haven't started getting in shape unless you're measuring it somehow. So just do that. It seems tedious, but that's how you're going to get results. There's no other way.
So helpful. Alisa, what would you recommend that we do to start this week?
Yeah, Ray, I think that was great. It's the tracking and paying attention. You're automatically going to catch and learn these trends. And the one thing I would say is when you're looking at this going, okay, but what do I track? Because within any business, any opportunity, there are 1,000 different numbers that you can pay attention to. And sometimes they feel overwhelming or they feel intimidating. And early on in business, I find oftentimes it feels discouraging. You feel like you're doing these at bats and you're like, but I didn't get that. I didn't hit that ball. What I have found is really helpful early on is Stop measuring the result and start measuring the activity. So who cares if somebody says yes or no? How many calls did you make that week? It doesn't matter what the outcome actually is. You'll naturally get better and do more. But a win means that you made the 10 calls you wanted to make that day. And tracking that sort of number is something that's so valuable because it's proving to yourself that you're doing everything you said you could do.
Andrea, how can we make better creative decisions by strengthening our confidence with the numbers?
Just to build on Rei and Alisa, I think it's about tracking your spread, not your average. Pick one thing that you've been avoiding and give it a weekly look at it. Same day, same time. It actually helps your brain not judge. And look at it first, right? And understand that when you check in on a number, it doesn't become a verdict then. It's a conversation that you begin to have. And so what Alisa was talking about between what are you doing in between, she was actually talking about what's in that spread. So if you're actually looking at writing things down once a week or tracking once a week, what's your best? So really simple. Best moment, worst moment. What happened in between? Was there audience response? Was there energy? Was there output? Was there anything else that happened in between that gap? And the distance between those two is actually where your most creative numbers will come from. It will tell you exactly where to experiment next. And if you just count one human thing this week, look at that collaboration that you're having with one other person or what that one metric is that you want to get to. I always say, though, go back to what you've been avoiding because it's underneath what you've been avoiding that you'll actually uncover just incredible data.
Love that. What we've been avoiding. Love it. Give it some attention. What a terrific conversation. I can't thank our panelists enough. Alisa Sparks, Andrea Carter, and Rei Vardi. Thanks so much for being on the show.
Thank you, Mark. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mark.
It's been so good. We've discovered really how knowing your numbers certainly isn't about being an accountant. You don't have to be the data geek in the room, but you're becoming a better creative leader. We've talked about measuring what matters most. I look at my notes and see research to guide decisions, understanding our customers, certainly tracking profitability, but building stronger organizations, communities, and then what impact are we making? So it's not the enemy of creativity. Instead, it can be one of creativity's greatest allies. Our greatest strength could be in the numbers that we've always thought maybe we were weak at, but we're probably better than we think. So I've listed all our guests' websites and LinkedIn profiles in the show notes. I really encourage you to connect with them, learn more about their work that they're doing, not just the numbers that we've talked about today, but there's so much other creativity that our guests have been expressing in their organizations and businesses, and we can learn a lot from them. And of course, if you enjoyed this roundtable, please subscribe, follow, and rate and review Your World of Creativity on your favorite podcast platform. Every review you put out there helps more creative leaders discover these conversations. So we hope you'll do that. And if you've enjoyed this series, we're going to continue these conversations around the principles uncovered in my book, Unlock Your World of Creativity. So stay tuned. So until next time, we'll keep asking better questions. We'll keep learning, keep measuring what matters, and together we'll keep unlocking your world of creativity. I'm Mark Stinson. Bye for now.